I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are Velocities in Music. This is our music podcast. A podcast in which Tom and I, two devout music heads, divulge our opinions, and this is an opinion-based podcast, on all things music. And we also have a lot of bad jokes and mispronunciations. That's for sure.
It's true.
That's
this
something
is
we specialize in. Trademark.
Yeah.
Today, Tom, we want to talk about duos in music, what that means, what constitutes a duo, because there's a lot of artists out there that would call it, have been referred to as duos, and are they really duos?
Right. It seems like it would be a simple question, and it's really not.
It's not.
Like duo, two people, boom, end of story, where this conversation's over.
So if I say, Tom, name me a musical duo, what's the first duo that comes to your mind?
In this case, for whatever reason, it was Outkast.
Outkast? Mine, Simon and Garfunkel.
Okay.
So when somebody says to me, name a musical duo, I immediately go to Simon and Garfunkel because the artist is commonly referred to by the name of the duo, like their actual names.
The and in the middle is really indicative, you know? Like that really helps to make things clear.
Like Outkast, how did you know that it was two people, you know?
Right. This guy and that guy.
Right.
Okay, must be a duo.
So I guess that leads in, Tom, to how important it is to define what a musical duo is. So what are some thoughts that you have around this subject? I know that you've been particularly excited about this podcast in general.
I have, because it is difficult to define, because there are kind of the more classic duos, like you mentioned, Simon and Garfunkel, you know, where the very definition of the group, so to speak, is that they're a duo. That defines the two members.
The whole reason for existence is the fact that it's those two participating in music together.
It wouldn't be, you can't have Simon and Garfunkel if Garfunkel's replaced. It'd be Simon and some other dude, which is why those ands kind of work. Now, you also have groups that might be centered around two main members, but you know, there's a rotating cast of characters and lineup changes, you know, but there's that two kind of stable members. And there are a lot of bands like that. Steely Dan's like that. Ween is like that. You know, they have accompanying musicians and even some very notable ones. I mean, Michael McDonald, for God's sakes, worked with Steely Dan for a long time, but you know, he kind of came and went, unlike the two main members. Right. On the other hand, though, how do you compare that with bands who just so happen to have like two members that have been with the band the whole time?
Right.
So like the first one that comes to my mind is like Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Yes.
You've got Flea and you've got Anthony Kiedis. They're the only two members that have been with the band the whole time. But you can't call them a duo.
Right.
You know, John Frusciante as a guitarist played a huge role. Hill Slavic before him played a huge role on the guitar. You know, that's just lineup changes, but it was never created with the intent of those two being a duo. It's a completely different context.
Yeah.
Then you have even, you know, fuzzier gray areas where, you know, like Menomina, one of our favorite bands of recent times, which started as a trio, a member left. Can you really call them a duo now? Like, I don't really consider them to be.
Right, we've seen them play live. They have more than two people on stage.
Right, that play a very key role.
So, and I guess that's a good question. Like, does being a musical duo, does that mean inherently that when you're on stage, it's just those two individuals?
I don't think so. I think it comes down more to who has control over the music. Because, you know, so another one to that point is Mars Volta.
We should definitely talk about the Mars Volta.
I think that one's a fuzzy line because Cedric and Omar definitely have creative control. But
I mean, from what I've read, it's Omar.
Omar
has creative control.
And then Cedric comes in and does his vocal thing. Right. But, you know, I think that this is a case where the musicians that they surround themselves with influence the music enough to really make a difference, to really make it their own. Now, at the same time, you could kind of say the same thing about Steely Dan, but with Steely Dan, you know, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen have really control over everything, and those guys were like hardcore about getting everything perfect. I mean, what they accomplished just in terms of production, but at the same time, then too, their producer, Gary Katz, their engineer as well, played a big part in that sound. So there are always other people that come into play with it.
So if you compare that, though, Tom, to an artist like, say, the White Stripes, you know, Jack and Meg White, you know, I don't really think, outside of like a couple songs here and there peppered throughout their discography, that Meg White had a very big role in the White Stripes. They are a duo very much from an instrumentation standpoint.
Right.
Jack White on guitar, Meg White on drums, but Jack White is easily the sole writer in that duo.
That's a good point, because there's the writing component and there's the performance component.
Absolutely.
And those are completely separate. The reason I would still consider White Stripes to be an epitomal duo of our time
is that there's just two of them.
And
on stage, there's two of them.
Right. And Jack White wasn't changing drummers every album.
Right.
Yeah, maybe Meg White wasn't writing the chord progressions and the lyrics, but
arguably Jack White might have wanted to consider changing drummers every album. I mean, if you're a fan of Meg White's drumming, this is a side note. We should probably do a White Stripes deep dive at some point in time. But like anybody who trashes on Meg White, like I will argue against that.
Yeah.
Because the point of the White Stripes, and this is, I think, relevant to the duo conversation, because the point of the White Stripes is not Meg White's drumming, it's Jack White's guitar playing and his vocals, right? Mm-hmm. That is the point of the White Stripes. It is not about, she is an accompanying musician at best.
And that's a really important part of the duo dynamic, is that you have an even split that needs to complement each other. Right. There's just a one direct relationship where those two members need to complement each other. And if that means that one person is not showboating and playing minimally, then that's fine.
Right.
One other that I would bring up is Gorillaz. Collaboration between Damon Albarn and Jamie Hewlett, but Jamie Hewlett only does like the animation and kind of the vision for it. Yeah. It's not really a musical role within how
from
things
a
are being
music
produced.
perspective, that is just a Damon Albarn side project.
And for Self-Titled with Dan the Automator, for Demon Days with Danger Mouse. Right. So the producer that he's working with, it plays a part as well, but still, because that's changing and because the only real consistent members of the band, one of them is just doing the visuals, I don't know if I can really consider them a musical duo.
Another side comment. I trust that all the listeners to the Velocities of Music podcast, when we say Damon Albarn, the first band that comes to your mind is Blur and not Gorillaz. Because here in the States, we really have this problem where we say Damon Albarn.
Oh, the Gorillaz guy.
And it's the guy from the Gorillaz, and they don't even, some people don't even realize that Blur's a band. And Blur's an amazing artist. In fact, when I walked into your house this morning, Tom, you were blaring Park Life.
I was getting me pumped,
and it made my day so much better just hearing that.
Well, I'm glad.
So, would you say that the Beatles were a duo? I mean, from a songwriting perspective, most of hear me out here. Hear me out here, Tom. From a songwriting perspective, Lennon and McCartney are credited with most of the writing.
Yes. They are.
But there's 4 Beatles.
And this is
Do I need to name them?
No.
Okay.
Once again, this is an area where the performance plays a strong part of it.
Right.
Because first off, George Harrison and Ringo Starr did write songs for the Beatles.
Right.
Ringo only wrote 2, and George, only had maybe a couple on each album.
Right.
Starting.
But Ringo certainly performed more than just 2.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. But the reason I'm saying the performance aspect matters is because let's even say, just for the sake of argument, that George and Ringo did not write any songs for the Beatles. That it was just Lennon and McCartney songwriting. You could not underplay or underappreciate the impact that George Harrison and Ringo Starr's performance styles had on the way that songwriting was manifested and recorded.
Right.
George Harrison has a very unique guitar style, and even from his solos and everything, that had an impact on the Beatles' music. To me, it's a matter of, would it have been more or less the same without them? Yeah. And I don't think you can say that about George and Ringo at all. No. Even if they hadn't contributed to songwriting.
Right.
But with the songwriting aspect, that's something that it's a fuzzy gray area. And actually, to be honest, Jake, I don't like a lot of the way that people document and give songwriting credit.
Okay.
Because to me, if you play on a recording, if you bring any kind of different flavor or personality to a recording, even if you didn't write the chord progression, even if you didn't write the lyrics, then to me, you are part of the songwriting. I consider that to be part of it. I think there is a close connection, and a lot of times it's just oh, well, I started the song, so you're just a guest artist on it.
So to go into detail here, Tom, and maybe even recall some personal examples from your life.
Sure.
Tom, you're a recording artist.
Yes.
Tom will never talk about his music because he's extremely bashful about it, but I think it's fucking great. And that's a very strong adjective to use there, but I want it to be very strong. I love your music, Tom, and I'll announce it to the world. But this isn't about that. This is about the fact that, Tom, you are not a duo of any kind when you write music. You are just you. You're a multi-instrumentalist, and in my opinion, an amazing songwriter. And obviously, for every single song on your albums, you have songwriting credit on those songs. Yeah. But because you're a multi-instrumentalist, you're a bassist and a guitarist first, and then you have all these other auxiliary instruments. You also play drums, but would you describe yourself as a talented drummer?
No.
Okay. So I'm not trying to criticize your drumming. I think you're a perfectly adequate drummer. But the thing is that on certain songs where you've recognized that you need where drums are going to play a key role on that song, you have gone and solicited help from friends who are good drummers in order to do so when they've come in and they've recorded drums for you, you've given them instructions. You're like, oh well, I think I kind of need this sort of drum beat and fills here, and like this is kind of my vision for it,
right?
And then they go write the part, right. So at that standpoint, would you give them credit?
Yeah. So at that, like Mike Ball, of course, my drummer and good friend who plays drums on a lot of my tracks. It does go very much that way, where I'll say this is kind of what I'm looking for. But the thing that I love about working with Mike, and the thing that he always brings to the table, is I can give him a bit of direction. Mm-hmm. And then he always takes it a step further and brings something that I wouldn't have anticipated, and I end up loving it.
Right.
And that's why I love working with him, because he and I really click. He knows sometimes what I'm going for when I don't.
Yes.
And that's the kind of compliment that I think you're looking for with a musical partner of any kind.
And so now you compare that to an artist like the Mars Volta, who, Omar has pretty famously I would say famously known for being the composer of the Mars Volta's very complicated, very long, complex, concept albums that they've created. And, Omar is kind of the director, and he he has all the different musicians come in, and he tells them what he's kind of thinking about for a particular song. And then they record individually, up until their most recent album, Nocturnicate. Mm-hmm. This is the style that they did. Omar would say, "Hey, I want you to do this," and then the instrumentalist would come in and then do whatever Omar said, but they would bring their particular flavor to it. Mm-hmm. So would you you think Omar should be giving that person songwriting credit?
I think it depends on how much say they have.
Okay.
And that's I think that's really difficult.
And that's where the shades of gray come in.
Exactly. It's really difficult to determine if you're not in the studio with them while that work is being done,
okay.
Yeah. I mean, if Omar is writing everything out for them and saying exactly what they should be doing, then to me, I think that's more to Omar's credit. Mm-hmm. If Omar's just saying, this is kind of what you should be going for, but surprise me, try some things out. If he's giving that musician any kind of artistic freedom, then maybe it's not full equal songwriting credit, but I think at least some credit should be acknowledged that they helped shape the way that songwriting was realized.
Yeah, because it's a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that sense, I think we can officially cross the Mars Volta and the Beatles, for that matter.
Yeah.
Off the list of these are definitely not duos.
Yeah.
What are some other artists, Tom, that people may think are duos that we would, because of the definition we are trying to establish here, that people may think are duos that we would define as probably not duos, or certainly we're not considering them?
Right. Well, I would say Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, the Rolling Stones.
The Rolling Stones are definitely not a duo.
No, definitely not a duo.
Okay.
I would also say, The Who, another classic band. Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend are the only two that have lasted, all this long time.
Well,
I mean, they were still releasing stuff. Right. And so did John Entwistle. But the thing is, I don't think anyone would argue that those four members were the main members of The Who. And while Roger and Pete have gone on to create some new material with some new people helping them, they have a songwriting partnership now, but I don't think anyone would consider The Who to be a duo.
Right. So what are some artists that may be controversial considerations for duos that you would consider duos?
So for that, I would have to say Ween. Ween is a group that I very much consider to be a duo, but at the same time, they've had members, come and go that have played an influence. But to me, the reason I consider them to be a duo is because during their formative years and really where they started to define what their music would be, it was very much just the two of them. I mean, in shows in the early 90s, they were still just performing as Dean and Gene Ween, just the two of them with like a drum machine and, not really any other human accompaniment.
Right. And similarly, I would throw They Might Be Giants into that mix. I mean, if you're recent to the They Might Be Giants bandwagon, if they even have a bandwagon, they're pretty underground, right? But it started off as just a duo, and then they added a full band later on in the 90s. And the thing is that now they really are a full band. But I think that in it itself is the argument where you can establish criteria of which to evaluate a duo. So, clearly, if there's only two people, it's a duo, right? If it's Simon and Garfunkel, that's a duo. Two people on stage. But I think that's what it comes down to, is that there has to be, from a songwriting perspective, two people that have dominant control over the songwriting, and two people who are the dominant performers.
Yes.
And I think that if you have either one, now if you have two people that are dominant songwriters, but there's also a third person involved in the group that's a dominant performer throughout the entirety of the group. I think Red Hot Chili Peppers would be a perfect example of this. That is not a duo, right? But I would argue, and I think that, Tom, I would consider the Mars Volta to be a duo, but right on the borderline of not being a duo.
Right.
Whereas I would argue that Ween, They Might Be Giants, definitely duos.
Yes.
Definitely duos.
And there are also a number of these kind of one-off duos that'll pop up. You've got Harold Budd and Brian Eno. You've got David Byrne and Brian Eno.
Very good point.
You got basically Brian Eno and anyone.
Brian Eno and Coldplay.
Right. They're a duo. Coldplay is one person.
One bag of feces and Brian Eno. I'm actually a fan of Coldplay's early work. And we need to talk about their new album at some point.
Yeah, at some point.
That's another conversation. But I think what you're talking about, Tom, is you're really bringing up collaboration duos
right.
versus career duos.
Yes.
And that's a very key difference, right? Like collaborative duos, David Byrne and St. Vincent, who we saw live. They were a fantastic collaborative duo. But obviously, they're not going to be a career duo.
Right. Another great career duo, She and Him, since M. Ward could just abandon all his crappy solo stuff. And
I want to vomit all over the microphone now.
I love how many of these podcasts, somehow She and Him has found a way to become relevant to the conversation.
Because it's torture to me. It's torture. I love M. Ward's early work so much, and then just his recent work is crap because of Zooey Deschanel. She just ruins everything.
I just bring it up just to see the look on your face when I say it. It's just priceless to me.
Well, it also completely throws me for a loop, and then I have to try to regain my composure and speak coherently, which I have a hard time doing normally. And then you bring up, the pure Zoe rage, and I can't do it.
Someday I'm just going to hang a poster of Zoe right behind me so that the whole time we're recording this podcast, you have to look at it.
Trent Reznor is glaring at you right now, Tom Hummer.
Probably. I can't see him though, so I'll try to block it from my mind.
Okay. Tom, one of the questions that we wanted to talk about was, how do duos affect certain genres?
Yeah, I think that there are genres that cater to the duo format more than others. And I think that this, Jake, is where the performance aspect comes into play.
Okay.
I think it's naturally going to be more difficult to make a duo work in a rock format. Simply because rock is all about very real live instrumentation, guitar, bass, drums. You have a lot of classic components, right. To a rock setup.
And I have yet to see somebody who can play guitar and bass at the same time at the exact same time, or bass and drums, or guitar and drums at the exact same time. Now, it's easy to combine vocals with any of those three other instruments, so you can have trios. Trios, I think, naturally fit the rock model.
Yeah.
But duos, I mean, it's very difficult to have a duo without an accompanying artist, which naturally muddies the definition of the duo.
I will say, and this is one that I'm ashamed to say, I think we left off our list, Jake, but a duo that we got to see perform live a number of years ago was Y Oak.
Oh, yeah.
And they, as a duo on stage, just the two of them on stage, had a terrific dynamic.
Absolutely.
Jen Wasner on the guitar and vocals was just killing it. And then I forget the gentleman's name, but playing drums
he sure is gentle,
and doing the bass on the lines on the keyboard at the same time.
Right.
That was impressive as hell.
So that's a good point. You could essentially have the bass beat, but keyboard. I'm talking like
rare.
a bass guitar.
But it's rare. And what I will say is, for a lot of rock duos, it's easier to just hire someone to just play the damn part for you.
Yeah.
Maybe you wrote it and recorded it.
But even then, when you hire somebody to come in and be an instrumentalist in your duo, your backing band, oftentimes they will become assimilated and become part of the band, and a duo evolves into a band over time. And partially, I would say that maybe They Might Be Giants is in that vein, you know.
And Ween very well might be too.
Absolutely. So I mean, like, when you think about rap duos, what are some top artists that come to mind? You already said Outkast. That was like when I said duo, you were saying Outkast.
Yeah, because the interplay between those two is just classic to me. You also have another artist, Eric B. and Rakim, classic hip hop from the late 80s. And they were very influential in hip hop. And once again, I mean, clear duo, because there's the and in there. In hip hop, rap is a genre that I think really caters to this. You know, some more modern ones. You've got Atmosphere,
Run the
Jewels, definitely. From the more classic days, you have also like EPMD and Gang Starr. And the reason that I think hip hop works for the duo format is, once again, because think about what happens in the studio versus a live performance. You can perform this live without necessarily needing a bunch of people on stage.
Yes.
A lot of hip-hop performances, you just have the backing beats that are just being played. Maybe you have some live performers, but most likely, if you do, they're just hired hands.
Well, and a lot of times a rap performance consists of like one main hip-hop artist up front doing the rapping, and then you have like a DJ in back.
And some of these artists, that's the interplay that they have. You know, there's the one person that does the rapping and one person that does the production. But even if they're both doing both, you know, that's something that can translate from the studio to the stage very easily.
Absolutely.
Because you can both be working in the studio together, constructing beats, constructing, you know, song structures and rhymes, lyrics, and then you take that to the stage and you just can kind of, you know, it's acceptable in hip-hop music and hip-hop performance to just play the backing beat while you perform. A couple others that I wanted to mention from more recent hip-hop duos are like Black Alicious and Shabazz Palaces, who we've seen some releases from recently that have been really strong. So it's a genre that format really works for, I think.
How about electronica?
It's kind of the same case. You know, while electronica doesn't always classically have the more vocal element to it, still, when it just comes to studio production and construction, I think that really works. You know, you have like Daft Punk, Boards of Canada, Chemical Brothers, Crystal Method. Yep. Absolutely. More recently, even like Justice and Disclosure, Fuck Buttons. But for there, you know, in hip hop, I think that there's certainly an element with the vocalist, and this is one you definitely see like with Outkast, for example, where it's good to have the variety in vocal approaches. Like Big Boy, I love Big Boy as a rapper. His solo albums have even been very good, but he still gets a lot of guest spots on there. Because I find that with rap, if you just have one person performing the whole time, it starts to get a little old.
Yeah.
That's why guest appearances in hip-hop is very common. And that's also why duos work for that vocal approach. With electronica, that's not quite as much of an issue, but where I think it really comes into play is just someone to bounce ideas off of.
Right.
I mean, Jake, I do that with you and my music all the time. You know, I very much see you as a collaborator to that standpoint.
Sure.
But with electronic music, I think it can be really helpful for just throughout the song construction and songwriting process. I think it's easy for solo artists to get too much up in their own heads.
Absolutely.
And having someone to act as kind of a check, bounce ideas off of, make sure that you don't go too much astray, keeps you on track. Like it's a good dynamic to have.
Yeah, so I think that brings up a good point, Tom, and I would be willing to go as far as saying that I think the duo format or structure of an artist structure actually suits the rap and electronica genres better than rock, because you know the other side of it is the human element, right? If you look at the band Fleetwood Mac. Lindsey Buckingham, probably, chief during the golden years of Fleetwood Mac in the mid 70s, obviously probably the chief songwriter, but I would include Stevie Nicks in that too. But the whole band contributed.
Oh yeah.
But because there was just more of them, because of the rock format that we discussed earlier, I think that the human element starts coming out. People piss other people off the more time you spend with them.
Yeah.
Right? I love my in-laws more than anything in the whole world. But I went on a 16-day vacation with them in August, and by the end, I didn't want to be around them anymore. I don't love them any less, but it just comes down to the fact that humans can't be around each other for an extended period of time without, especially in close proximity, without getting on each other's nerves and having relationships suffer.
And with that, I'd really like for you to leave. I'm just...
We're done. 6 years of Velocities of music, and it's just Tom. That's why we had to take a year off.
That's right. Sorry for derailing you there.
No, well played, Tom. And do we constitute as a musical duo? I mean, we don't actually make music together. I mean,
that's true.
Not
kind
really.
Of,
I mean,
of.
I don't like you. You say I help. I don't really help because it's all you. But I mean, we're talking about music.
Yeah, absolutely.
Should we top our list?
Well, we're a podcast duo, but actually I think a lot of the dynamic things that we're talking about comes into play here. Yeah. We definitely keep each other on the right track. We bounce ideas off of each other in terms of the vision of the podcast and our content. And I think that the same can be said musically when people are constructing albums.
A podcast about music with just me would be pathetic, because I want everyone to know Tom Hummer is a walking music encyclopedia. The guy can recall anything, any date, names, anything off the top of his head. And like I'm nothing without having Wikipedia in front of me. And like I'll research stuff and look it up, and I like vaguely know, but I don't remember dates and names like Tom does. The dude is incredible.
Except for the drummer from Wyoke, apparently. I feel like a douche. I can't remember that guy's name.
You're such a douche for not remembering that one tiny little detail.
Right.
I'm going to look it up. Keep talking. I'm gonna look it up.
Okay, we have to do that guy justice now.
Yeah, he deserves it because he's a gentleman.
What's your beef with me saying gentleman? What is that about?
They are an American indie rock duo from Baltimore, Maryland, composed of Jen Wasner and Andy Stack.
Andy Stack.
Yeah.
That's a pretty badass name.
So you had a Stack Tracer there.
You're throwing development jokes into
I said at the beginning of the podcast, the jokes are bad.
This is going off the tracks. So
maybe we should bring it back to the list that we're trying to put together.
Right, absolutely.
Okay. So in that case, Tom and I are huge fans of lists, and oftentimes on this podcast, we like to put together sometimes random lists about anything. Sometimes they're even nonsensical. In this case, the duo podcast, we have a borderline nonsensical list because we have to qualify it. There's no way not to, right? So this list that we're putting together, our top 10 favorite musical duos, we have to put this caveat on. In general, this is of the modern era.
Yes.
Which I personally would define as anything from the 90s on. 90s on. Now, I'm spoiler alert, They Might Be Giants shows up on this list, and obviously the Giants, I think, started in 1987. Tom knows.
86.
Yeah, because he can just pull up. Look, proof. Walking
it's one of my favorite years, man. 1986. I'd keep tabs on that.
Yeah, it's one of the best years in music. We've discussed that. We could do a whole podcast just on years of music.
We should.
That's actually a great idea, Tom. Write that down.
Let's do it.
Write that down.
Okay.
I'll write it down. I have my computer in front of me because I can't remember everything. So with that, we're gonna talk about just our favorite artists, our favorite duos of the modern era. But with that, we're leaving a lot off the list that I think deserve to be called out. So let's go through the list, and then afterwards, we'll start going through. So just so you guys don't freak out as you're hearing this list, we're certainly going to talk about some of the classic duos afterwards. So let's start the list off, Tom.
All right, at number 10 on our top 10 list of our favorite duos of this modern era, we have the Dodos. Dodos are an indie rock duo that have just consistently impressed Jake and I with their releases over the last several years, really. We first reviewed their album Visitor as kind of a throwback, and that really impressed us.
Yeah, it was a request back in the Velocity and Music TV days, video review days.
Right, and that album stylistically just has a lot of charm to it. But there's also Dodos tend to have this kind of like sinister underbelly, like this kind of like
brooding,
like dark sarcasm,
austere,
right? Yeah. But a lot of very rhythmic kind of rim clicks in the drumming. There's a lot of sweeping acoustic guitar,
very fast-paced, progressive acoustic guitar.
Since then, they've come out with albums like No Color, Carrier. This year, they came out with Individ. While some of those albums I like better than others, consistently I find their style to be appealing, and I find them to be unique, which is something I really value.
Yeah, and you were describing the drums. The word that I find I use a lot when I'm attracted to drums, and it's certainly the case with the Dodos, is bombastic.
Yeah.
The drums seem to just be explosive.
Yes.
And I think that goes a lot to, credits a lot of their songwriting ability, because they're able to really create a dynamic shift in a song, both in the guitars, the vocals, and especially the drums. But the drums really control the pace of the Dodos song, and it's why they're such good songwriters.
That is a great point, because you and I are all about dynamics. We value dynamics very highly in music. And
I'm very loud, and you're more soft spoken.
the drums in Dodos really shapes those dynamics, because the drummer knows when to keep things small and very tight and very quiet, and then builds into these huge, as you said, explosive moments. And for that, it also shapes their kind of longer, more growing tracks, which is just how their tracks often end up structuring out.
Following the Dodos, at number 9 on our list, we have Japandroids. Japandroids are known from, at least Wikipedia, please donate, by the way, a Canadian rock band from Canada, consisting of Brian King and David Prowse. Brian King plays guitar and vocals. They both sing on their 2 albums, and David Prowse is the drummer. So very similar setup to the Dodos. It's interesting that these are number 10 and number 9 on our list, and I would even argue, Tom, that maybe the Dodos deserve to be a little bit higher, just because Japandroids only has released 2 albums.
Right.
In 2009, they released Post Nothing, and then in 2012, they released Celebration Rock. Now, it is the very, very end of 2015, and they have like 2 weeks left to release their 3rd record, to stay in this 3-year trend that they're in.
Right.
And but really we only have 2 great Japandroids records, and I remember like when I first listened to Post Nothing in 2009, and I remember loving it and showing it to everyone I know, and they all said, "This is garbage."
I hated it.
Yeah, you hated it.
I did.
Do you like it more now?
I do.
Okay, we reviewed it, I think.
Yeah, and it ended up growing on me. A lot of it's just there's that charm to it. It's very,
charm.
very authentic.
Yes.
And then but really Celebration Rock just blew it out of the water for me.
So very similar setup to the Dodos, but you have the drums, and then you have the guitar, and that's what really drives the sound. But it's not nearly as bombastic as the Dodos, and the guitar is primarily electric guitar. But it is more a rock-based sound, where the Dodos are a very indie, creative-based sound. This is a very like it's structured to sound like rock music. And they have an album called Celebration Rock, and that's a really pretty apt description of their sound. But one of the big complaints that everyone has pretty much cited with Post Nothing is that it was very sloppy.
Yeah.
You had all this charm in the songwriting, and they were quite progressive songwriters, but even the lyrics seemed a bit juvenile at times, and the drums seemed to be all over the place and a bit sloppy. Whereas 3 years past, the band gets a lot of credit. They go on a big tour, and then Celebration Rock comes out in 2012, and all of that slop suddenly goes away.
And the lyrics get better too. And they're just all about these driving, punky anthems. And they get stuck in your head. It's feel-good music. And, I do agree that right now the scope of their work is fairly limited, but I really enjoy them, and they're definitely a band to try and keep up with, I would say. All right, at number 8 on our duos list, we've got MGMT, another more modern one. Their first album, Miracular Spectacular, came out in 2007. Since then, we've seen 2 other albums from them, Congratulations and Self-Titled. And this band is just all over the place. The thing that I really respect about MGMT is that Oracular Spectacular was huge. It was a really offbeat, to me, unexpected success because it really defies the mainstream in a lot of ways, but then helped to define the mainstream moving forward.
Right.
Because the songwriting quality just couldn't be denied. But what I really like about this group is that they took that success, and instead of just trying to repeat it, they just went off the wall and they went in a different direction.
They evolved their sound.
Right. Congratulations saw, rather than a lot of like the thicker, dancier beats of Oracular Spectacular, Congratulations was a lot more psychedelic, kind of mid-range, 60s kind of throwback sound at times. And then their self-titled album was just crazy. It sounded
very
more like Flaming Lips,
absolutely
experimental kind of tracks. And so to see a band become really successful like that and still be adventurous and move forward and experiment with their sound and still maintain a high quality of output is very impressive to me.
Now, Tom, you've referred to them as a band twice, so I think we have to ask, do they pass the duo test?
I think they do.
Okay, so they were founded by a guy named Benjamin Goldwasser and Andrew Van Wingarden.
Yeah.
They have pretty awesome names. And
Yeah,
no, I did not. Tom probably knew those off the top of his head. I was referencing my laptop here. But they were founded by those two artists. So they inherently started as a duo, then incorporated members of their live band, and they've officially become a band. But I think for all intents and purposes, while it might be a bit of a cop-out, admittedly, I think we would still consider them a duo.
Well, because they, those two members really determine the direction of the band. They have a lot more of the studio control.
Their success today is inherently dependent on those two members,
right?
Which I think is what puts them just above the line,
right,
towards the duo argument,
right. It is more of a spectrum, isn't it? It really is, and I would put MGMT in that realm.
From MGMT, we're going to move on to Daft Punk, probably the most well-known electronic music duo, probably one of the most well-known electronic music acts ever.
Definitely.
They're a French music duo. I'm going to slaughter their names. I'm not even going to try to do a French accent here, so brace yourself. Guy Manuel de Cristo and Thomas Bangalter. So these two guys whom, they take the human element kind of away, because when they perform on stage, they're normally in black tie suits, and then they're wearing these like space helmets. And it creates this almost alter ego for the band. It makes them seem
they're an entity.
Yeah, they're an entity, right? And that's kind of cool that they're explicitly a duo, but they've also created something more, which I think is pretty impressive. These guys have had 4 albums. Several, I think, have reached a legendary status, at least in the electronic music realm. 1997's Homework, which is still a modern-day classic. I listen to it all the time, and I think it's heralded as just one of the best electronic albums of all time. From there, they had Discovery in 2001, Human After All in 2005, and then in 2013, which was on our favorite albums of 2013 list, they had Random Access Memories,
which really wasn't even an electronica album.
It really wasn't.
It was all very real instrumentals
and
recorded.
A lot of samples,
right? And samples as well. Some analog synths and things. But I mean, these guys, they have been hugely influential in electronic music and dance music in general. And what's really been cool to see of them is that they can maintain this status, first off, while not really having a very regular output of material. It was a long time between Human After All and Random Access Memories, but also the change that they go through. When you go back to their first album, their debut had like nothing in the way of vocals on it. And then they start to incorporate that slowly over their next releases. So to see that, while the vocals on Random Access Memories play a huge part, but what they did in their early days is prove that they don't rely on that element. Now it is there to supplement it, but they really don't rely on any one thing. They're not a one-trick pony. They can still take this genre and evolve it, and they've already done that so much. And number 6, we've got Tenacious D, Jack Black and Kyle Gass.
The D, baby.
The D. This is one that they've had some notable supporting musicians like Dave Grohl on the drums. But it all comes back to Jack Black and Kyle Gass. And I think part of that association also is if you've seen the TV show that they had or, the movie, then it's really about those two. They're the stars of the show as well. But they're the stars of the music. And, Kyle Gass's terrific acoustic guitar work, along with Jack Black's just crazy vocals, is really what defines these two. And the thing is, they're one that you could, in some ways, almost consider a joke band, but they're so much more than that.
I mean, they're considered a comedy rock duo, but they are so much more than that. And if you look, I mean, the problem with Tenacious D is they're never going to top their debut album, self-titled Tenacious D, which came out in 2001. And if you critically pick that album apart, you cannot walk away saying that it is just a joke record or a comedy record. It is so much more than that.
Is so great.
The songwriting is fantastic. The instrumentation is just out of this world good. And they relatively brought light to at least a very unpopular genre, or not popularized yet genre, of acoustic metal. Yeah. And I think that in and of itself is such a dynamic thing to do, an accomplishment that you have to give these guys credit. Now, arguably, The Pick of Destiny, Rise of the Phoenix, those albums have not lived up to their debut, but they're still, I think, pretty solid, and entertaining, and bring a lot to the forefront. Now, they also just announced a new album, but it's to be determined when it will come out.
Right. And it's funny, one thing worth mentioning is I think that it's difficult with Tenacious D to separate the music itself from the show, the movie, if you're a fan of the whole Tenacious D package, right? But the thing that I like about it is even the show and the movie focus around their musicianship, focus around the band aspect of it. You could almost say the same thing about Flight of the Conchords, another great kind of a parody comedy musical duo. But the thing is for Flight of the Conchords, while I love the show, I don't find myself going and listening to their albums. With Tenacious D, I do.
Next up, we have Phantogram. Phantogram, American electronic rock duo. They're from New York. We actually got to meet these guys right after their first album came out a few years ago, Tom. But they're comprised of Josh Carter, who does mainly the guitars on the album, but he also does some vocals, and Sarah Barthel. I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name. One of those two, and she does the keyboards along with being primary vocalist. So this duo has 2 albums out. Eyelid Movies, as we mentioned, came out in 2009, and Tom and I absolutely love that record. And a number of key tracks, Mouthful of Diamonds and When I'm Small, are really the 2 key tracks that I've come back to many times over the past few years, and that album in particular is just so good throughout. And then last year, 2014, they had their second album, Voices. Voices had a song that I think was one of my favorite songs of the year, and that's Blackout Days.
Yeah, really strong album. The thing that I love about this group too is that both of their albums were growers for me. Those end up being my favorite albums a lot of the time. First time I heard Voices, I was like, they changed direction a little bit. I don't know if I like it. But once I got to know the songwriting, that album is incredibly good. And Jake, if you and I had finished out 2014, I think that would have been close to the top of our albums list for that year.
Absolutely.
They also had the Nightlife EP come out between those two. More recently, they formed Big Grams with Big Boy from Outkast. And they've done some other collaborations as well. And I mean, these two are really just getting out there, and it's great to see because while they haven't had a really extensive career up to this point, they've only had 2 true LPs, but just the quality of both of them is so high that I think they have a very deserved spot on our list.
It makes you really excited to see where they go from here,
right?
Because they I would say that they've evolved so much just within their 2 albums that really the sky's the limit for this duo.
And number 4 on our list is Outkast. Classic hip-hop duo, Big Boy and Andre 3000. Outkast to me is just legendary. I mean, they've been putting out albums since the early 90s and just have not had a weak spot. Now, of course, they've since kind of dissolved the group. But, man, I mean, up till the end, they were changing hip-hop. Both in style, but also just in quality. I think that the standard of quality they held their records to is incredible, and of course, to me at least, that culminates with the release of Stankonia, which to me is their masterpiece. But the thing that I love about Outkast is Outkast fans could argue all day about that. ATLiens is great, Aquemini is great, Speakerboxxx The Love Below double album that they put out in 2004, I believe, is great. I mean, they were consistently killing it.
All right, Tom, getting to the final 3 of our favorite duos list. Number 3 is They Might Be Giants, an American alternative rock. I wouldn't even call them. What a crappy description. These guys are definitely a duo. It's John Linnell and John Flansburgh. John Flansburgh, I think he primarily plays guitar, and John Linnell is the master of the accordion, which is a predominantly used instrument throughout They Might Be Giants' works. Now, these guys definitely started as a duo. They released several albums. Their self-titled album came out in 1986. It's my favorite They Might Be Giants album. From there, their second album, Lincoln, 1988, Flood, and then Apollo 18. Their first 4 records they did,
so solid too.
They're just fantastic throughout. Those were all just the 2 Johns. And then, they moved to Elektra, a bigger label than what they were on, because they started off relatively as this underground indie act. I mean, you listen to They Might Be Giants, and there really isn't music out there that's too much like this.
No, very unique.
It is very unique. You have the really coy, thoughtful, satirical lyrics. Their lyrics are like puzzles that you have to unwind and really make you think. So if you're just listening at a surface level, you probably won't get everything that you could out of the music. You really have to dive deep. But then you have all sorts of creative instrumentation going on in the background and sound effects and different things to form these really just almost playful, almost cinematic sound. It's really difficult to describe because it's so colorful and so unique and so full of ideas that there's nothing else out there like that. You just have to listen to it. Now, I will say that They Might Be Giants music is inherently abrasive, but once you get over just the uniqueness and the abrasiveness of the sound, it's super rewarding. They recruited a full band in 1994 and released John Henry, and after that, they released a number of records over the next few years that I think are not given, or maybe a little underrated.
Yeah.
And the reason is that they probably just don't live up to the acclaim that the first 4 They Might Be Giants records did. But since then, they've been very prolific over the last few years. As well as putting out several kids records, but they also they released Join Us in 2011, an album that you and I reviewed and liked, Nanobots in 2013, which we reviewed and liked, and then this year in 2015 they've been releasing a song every week, and they've put together 2 compilation records around those weekly releases. Glean came out in April. I think Y is out or supposed to come out soon. I haven't listened to it yet, though.
And between that and like the dial-a-song format that they were doing back in the early days, these guys are about so much more than just their music. But the music itself is terrific, and it's one of those situations, one of those rare situations where you have any one of their albums. Not only does any one of their albums not really sound like anything else out there, but they culminate to create this body of work that is just so unique. I mean, Jake, you used that word several times, and I don't know how better to say it.
Yeah.
There is nothing else out there like They Might Be Giants.
Looking in the alley by the light switch, who watches over you? Make a little birdhouse in your soul, not to put too fine a point on it. Say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. Make a little birdhouse in your soul.
And number 2, we have a band we've mentioned a couple times, the White Stripes. Very classic duo of our modern age. They've been, a point of controversy. They've been talked about a lot. They're kind of one of those either you love them or you hate them bands. I'll say I used to hate them.
You did.
But they're one of those bands that for me, and I'm ashamed to admit it, I hated them until I actually started listening to them. And I think it's easy to hate a band when you only hear a few songs and are underwhelmed. But the White Stripes is another one of those groups that it's not about any one track. It's not about Seven Nation Army. It's not about, just those hits. It's about listening to the entire scope of their work and recognizing what they accomplished as a group. And I think that they accomplished quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think it's also getting over the fact that Meg White exists as part of the duo. I mean, just flat out, Meg White's drumming is not the best drumming, but that's not the point. Ringo Starr's drumming wasn't the best drumming,
right,
but it served a function as providing the rhythmic foundation for the Beatles sound. Similarly, the White Stripes are not about the drums. If you're listening to the White Stripes to listen to drums, you're probably not going to get a lot out of it, and I think that's where a lot of people, a lot of White Stripes haters, fall off the bandwagon. Whereas, like, if you're listening to the White Stripes for really dirty bluesy guitar and very creative songwriting and Jack White's just very iconic vocal style and lyrical style, I think that you get a lot more out of the White Stripes sound. It's particularly an album that we reviewed as a throwback, Tom, that I think is the highlight of the White Stripes' career is Day Still, which I think is just one of the best records ever made.
And I think that the reason that one sticks out is because, it's more polished than their debut, but it's before they got so big that I think that after the success of White Blood Cells and Elephant, I think I don't know if it's that they got a little more self-conscious, but I feel like Get Behind Me, Satan, and Icky Thump, while those are good records, they didn't quite capture that same kind of charm, and it still is really the sweet spot for me.
They started going and utilizing a lot more pop hooks, and not that that's a bad thing. There's a number of great tracks on those records, but they just don't have the dirt and the grit that really defined the sound of the White Stripes and got them on the map. And so they lost some of that grit, and so it's almost as if they lost some of their identity. And to me, it's no surprise that Icky Thump, which came out in 2007, is their last last record as the duo has dissipated at this point.
Because where do you go from there?
Where do you go from
Yeah.
there? They had a great run and they ended. Honestly, they ended before they made a really bad record,
Yeah.
which is what happens a lot of times when duos or artists break down, when the relationship breaks down, whether it's a musical or a personal relationship.
Hello, operator. Can you give me number 9? Can I see you later? Will you give me back my dime? Tell me oscillator. Twist it with the dog.
Coming in at number 1 on Velocities and Music's favorite duos list is Ween.
Yes.
Now, Ween is one of the more controversial duo picks, Tom, that we discussed earlier in the podcast about. Are they really a duo?
Well,
absolutely.
Yeah, they are.
Absolutely.
They
are.
follow a similar path to They Might Be Giants, where it was just the two in the beginning. They formed a band somewhere along the way, but as we've seen in recent years, they can't be Ween unless Gene and Dean are both there.
Absolutely.
And they've gone on, as kind of individual acts. They've formed other acts, but they can never call themselves Ween unless both parties are present.
How would you describe Ween's music, Tito?
Completely insane. I
Completely
don't know,
insane.
all over the place.
Yeah.
The reason to me, though, and actually that's kind of a cop-out of a description.
It is. I was going to call you out.
But the problem is that they're so diverse that you can't just throw a label on them. You can throw labels on their albums, but we could spend all day going through their individual albums and trying to define what the genre or the style is. In their early days, it was a lot more, once again, it'd be a mistake to call them a joke band because there's so much musicality there. It's just underneath this layer of absolute madness.
Madness and satire.
Yes,
Because
a lot of satire.
And Ween, to me, especially early Ween, really embodies satire, not only like in a lyrical form, but also in a musical form. It's almost, they're like the Andy Warhol of music at times, because they're trying to make music that is just, Nirvana kind of did this with their first record, but they're trying to make music that's so grating on your senses that you just naturally hate it. But in that's where the genius is at,
Right.
because when I listen to The Pod, or especially Pure Guava.
That's my favorite one.
Like, the sound is just so grating, but at the same time, like, there's nothing else out there like that.
Oh,
and there's
not at
something
all.
inherently beautiful about that.
Right. So the reason to me that they are the ultimate duo is it's that cross section of variety and quantity with quality. What they accomplished in their career, spanning about 20 years of actually releasing studio albums, that is they didn't put out any absolutely crappy records.
No.
There are some that I like more than others,
Sure.
some that hold more merit. Their first two records, Godwin, Satan, The Oneness, and The Pod, are difficult. They're difficult records, and I wouldn't even consider those to be good entry points to their catalog, but if you go back and revisit them later, there's still a lot of merit there. They're rewarding once you get through them. But any one of their albums, you don't get from anything else that they've done. Like, they are completely unique. I guess what I'm getting at is they can't be summed up by any one record, and I would actually say if you just cherry-picked 3 of their records, you're still not getting a full understanding of Ween.
Right.
There is so much there to wrap your head around that if I just pulled Pure Guava, Chocolate and Cheese, and The Mollusk, well, then you're not hearing La Cucaracha, you're not hearing Quebec, you're not hearing The Pod, you're not hearing
12 golden
12 golden country greats.
Their country satire album,
Right.
which is fantastic.
Right. There's nothing, like, you can't understand them without getting the big picture. And there's so much there that creates just this mural of genius.
Mach 10 at sudden speed, flying into the wind now. I'm throwing at my feet.
I'm no dope, but I can't cope. So hit the fucking road and piss up a rope. You can piss up a rope. Up to the gators in the swamp and you drive me crazy with that boogie, oogie, 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 oogie. You drive me crazy with that boogie.
So, Tom, first of all, that concludes our favorite duos list, but those are all modern era artists. what are some classic artists that we pretty intentionally left off this list?
Yeah, well, we talked about Simon and Garfunkel and Steely Dan. I think those two are undisputed classics. I would also say like the Everly Brothers. There's the Louvin brothers from way back even earlier. The Carpenters were a really great duo. There's a lot from back then that, I think are worth mentioning because of the impact that they've had on music. But, for our more recent list of stuff that we're digging into and enjoying, I don't feel like I can really put the Carpenters right next to Ween and try to compare them.
It's just not fair.
Right, it's not the same. Another one that I think that we failed to mention that's worth mentioning is Melt Banana. We got to see them a while back, and they've had a very expansive career as a duo and accomplished a lot. Very unique, noisy sound.
Yeah, The Knife.
The Knife, definitely. Kind of more on the electronica side, but also, some pop. There's vocals in there.
Sleigh Bells,
yeah. Another good rock duo.
Yeah. There's a lot of duos out there. And before going through this exercise of putting together a random pointless list of favorite duo albums, I didn't realize how many duos are out there in modern music today, and what that effect has on music and really how I listen to the music. Tom, I think that wraps up our discussion of what is a duo in music and what a duo can bring to the table in our list of favorite duos of the modern era. As always, Tom and I are very interested in getting your opinions on our podcast, particularly for this podcast. Who is your favorite duo? And are there any notable omissions from our list that you would include? As always, thank you guys so much for your constant participation in Velocities in Music. You guys are exactly why Tom and I decided to start doing video reviews many years ago, and now this podcast is creating this collaborative environment where we can discuss music in an open forum. So we always appreciate you guys reaching out via email, Facebook, our website, our YouTube channel. Every time you guys reach out, we do our very best to try and respond, and we appreciate your support and your participation, because that's what Velocities in Music is all about. Tom and I do Velocities in Music because we like talking about music. We keep this thing running because it's fun for us. We don't need money or advertisements or anything like that, but what we want is for you guys to help us out by sharing Velocities in Music with your friends and family whom you think would benefit from listening to this podcast. If there is one thing you could do for us, it's that, and we greatly appreciate any of your referrals. Next week, we will be debuting our Best of 2015 list, our album list for the year of 2015.
It's going to be big.
Yeah, it's going to cover a lot of records, that's for sure, Tom. And I think that we should also probably at some point do some sort of podcast around disappointments.
Yeah, we should.
Because every year there's a number of records that I find just are truly disappointing that I was looking forward to. And a lot of times they're my favorite artists, like M. Ward when he started hanging out with Zoe. So I think it's important that we devote some time to that as well. So next couple of weeks will be a lot of favorite and disappointment albums from 2015, and then we'll be moving on into 2016 and have a bunch of new albums to go through for the next year. That wraps up our podcast for today. Thank you guys for listening. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.